So we have these amazing 4 women, and they are all ordained. We're grateful for them. And I will just preface this by sharing just a very brief moment of my story. I was ordained in the old system of deacon elder so long ago that most of you don't even know what I'm talking about. So I was ordained a deacon in 1982. And the normal process at that time was after 2 years further service, you could become an elder. It took me 3 years. And this was one of those moments that I could see a little bit of a gender barrier to the normal process from what it should have been. So that was my experience, or one of my experiences. So here we have women who are female in a male-dominated denomination. We have women who are not white in a white-dominated denomination. And so we just want to kind of hear your story. So we're just going to start here with Soo Ji and just go down the line. That makes it simple. And some of them have learned your names, but say your name again. And then I'm just going to have you share your first, your current position, even if we've already heard it, repeat that for us. So what you're doing now, and then just an experience that you've had, just a story you want to share about some of the barriers you've experienced. So go ahead, Soo Ji.
All right. Okay, well, I'm Soo Ji again, and I pastor in Riverside, California. And of course, a lot of different barriers that I could talk about, but I'll talk more personally. Obviously, as an Asian American woman, there's a lot of barriers. You know, so for some of you, this might be your first time seeing an Asian American woman pastor. There's actually a lot of us out there. We're not unicorns. You can find more of us. There's some more that should be in this chair for next time. And so just once again, recognizing that, you know, when we're viewed as constant foreigners, and then we're also viewed as somebody who's not qualified to pastor a church that's non-Asian, right? Because some people still look at me and might assume that, oh, I'm Buddhist, so I must serve in a monastery or a temple somewhere. And that makes it really challenging. It makes it challenging when I am pastoring by myself and trying to do a hospital visit. The nurses are very confused that I'm there to visit a parishioner who's elderly, who's probably white. It makes it harder for me to navigate systems. And so I do have to carry my business card, my pastor card, my ordination card, to have greater credibility that I am who I say I am. And it reminds me of that song, I am who you say I am. Here's my card. That's me. And so, yeah, just always having to constantly prove myself. And of course, growing up, I grew up in a Korean church. So I was surrounded by a lot of people that looked like me, but once again, not a female pastor that looked like me. And then going into the American church, which is predominantly white, once again, surrounded by pastors that did not look like me. And so a lot of the barriers that I've experienced, I'm so thankful for the women that have paved the way. I did see other women pastors and leaders. So thankful for the opportunities that I've had to be mentored by and equipped by other women pastors. I want to take a quick moment for any of you women or male advocates that are out there to plug the Women's Clergy Conference coming up in March 8th, 9th, and 10th in Grapevine, Texas. That was a really key event for me in my confirmation of calling to ordination, to see a room full of 600 other women pastors, a lot of them senior pastors, and to recognize that that was part of the calling that God had for me. So thank you.
Thank you. So I'm Marianne Pena. And I realize that many people can't pronounce it because the ñ is not a letter in the American English alphabet, but it is in the Spanish. So it's an N with a little thing on top, and it's Peña. I have to tell everyone Pena, just get it over. But it's one of those issues, right? That's kind of twofold, like Soo Ji, I'm not just a woman, but then you add to it that I'm a Latina woman. And I think a lot of the barriers are twofold. Oh yeah, before I get there, my husband and I, we co-pastor, so I get you and your husband on the whole co-pastoring thing. We co-pastor a bilingual church in Miami, Florida. And we've got 3 boys. It's a lot of fun, mostly. So For me, it's twofold, because it's not just being a woman, but then it's being a Latina woman. And I love my Latinos, but I can say maybe based on geography, based, I think, culturally, you didn't see a woman pastor. You saw a pastor's wife, and we all called her pastora out of respect, but she was not the pastor. It was made very clear that he was the pastor, and she kind of just came along for the ride. And I never saw a woman lead in the form of a pastor. So when I started to feel the call, it was kind of like, this doesn't make sense. Why would God be calling me to this when I don't have a reference for this? But I knew God was calling me. And I think one of the biggest things that happened, that maybe marked me, was, and I don't think I've ever shared this with anyone because I kind of just kept it moving and brushed it off, was when I was a CMC, I was having children. And in one of those pregnancies, I think I received an email, something along the lines of, maybe you just want to have your kids and raise them. And maybe sometime in the future, you can look towards ordination. And it was one of those things like, do I really have to pick and choose? And at the moment, I didn't have the reference of a woman pastor. So I kind of was just like, okay, you guys can discontinue me as a CMC and let's see what the Lord says. Thankfully, I then continued on and, got my ordination. But those were one of those moments when I kind of had to wrestle with, is God really calling me? Because I don't really feel that much affirmation. And then it wasn't a normal thing for women because you're only as good as your husband was, and as a woman leader, you're good if your husband's good. Right. And you're only as strong or as maybe reliable or as credible as your husband was. And I didn't see that. And I would echo what Soo Ji said, the Women's Holiness, Wesleyan Holiness Women's Conference. When I went there, I was like, oh my God, there's so many. I'm the only one. It was me and one other pastor from Florida. And we were just like, there's a bunch of us out there. So it's an encouragement, but more than anything, it's a struggle for some of us because there are many who may be wrestling with a call and they don't know that it's truly possible, whether it's them as the lead pastor or in a co-pastoring role like we are, and they need our affirmation.
We've all referenced that particular conference. I started attending that in the late 90s when we were still calling it Come to the Water. I absolutely loved Come to the Water as the name of the conferences, but I hated the theme song. You all remember that?
I think I know who I say I am a little better.
It was really a bad song. Anyway, my name is Amelia Cleveland-Traylor. I am one of two superintendents for the River Conference. I live in San Antonio, Texas, where it's very hot. And what's interesting to me on this road toward ordination and ministry is that the African-American church that I grew up in before coming to Methodist Church didn't have an issue at all with women in ministry. It just whoever was leading. And so I hadn't really given that much thought, even though I wasn't seeing other women. It was never forbidden. It just hadn't happened in our tiny little church. So, switching then over to the Free Methodist Church and realizing that the obstacles toward women in professional things was pretty much just the same. I viewed it the same way as I run into obstacles with women in medicine and women in science. I'm a chemistry major. I did math and chemistry, and most women are not doing math and sciences. So, it had been kind of the same thing all along. So quite frankly, I didn't give it that much thought altogether. And I've been fortunate that Mike and I have been in ministry together through most of the time that we've done formal ministry at all. But there's absolutely the obstacles that are there. And one of the things that stuck out to me was this time at which one of our parishioners was having a major surgery done, and she was going to be not able to come to church for a while. And Michael had gone and prayed with her prior to her surgery, but I did pretty much all of the hospital visits and the home visits for several weeks' time. And when this parishioner was finally able to return to church, she wasn't grateful that I had been coming to see her so faithfully. She was mad at him for not coming because he's the pastor. And so she completely negated all the time that I had invested in her. And then the same thing happened with a church member who had been sick. I was the one visiting her at the hospital and then in her home. But then when she passed away, her family member, her significant other, called him to tell him what was going on before we started arranging for the services. And so there were a number of times where the work that I put in as a pastoral leadership person in the church was just not seen as pastoral. I guess I was just being a nice person. And so I've had other women come to our house for dinner and sit at my table and tell me what's wrong with women in ministry. I'm like, it's one thing when you do that out in your house, but how dare you come into my house and tell me that I'm not supposed to be a woman pastor? It's kind of pathetic things that happen like that. So it was another one of those times when I would use my reservedness and my quietness until I didn't. And so, I've had those kind of moments, but those are the kinds of things that happen to women in ministry all of the time. And it now happens so much that at some point you just have to be convinced of your call. If you know that you're going to answer to God and he's the one that's talking to you, you got to block out the other voices. And so that's where most of us will eventually arise if we're not there already when he calls you to this.
Thank you. I'm Marissa Mattox Heffernan. I am newly serving as the Associate Pastor of Discipleship at New Hope in Rochester. And this is why stories have been so important, especially for me, because you begin to identify those common threads that weave through and identify where it's like, oh, it's not just me. I'm not alone. And that has been a major part of my story. So being a multiracial person, I mentioned earlier how I present pretty ambiguously. I never know how people are going to receive me stepping into a space. Common thread, I went to a church where I had never seen a woman pastor, and any people of color that I saw in positions of authority, they were secondary. So when I received the call into ministry, I was just like, can I be called? Is that allowed? Is there a space for that? But what I had learned as a follower of Jesus is I had learned to get so in the habit of saying yes to God that whatever he's asking you to step into is going to be less comfortable than saying no to what is being asked of you. So I stepped anyways. And I was kind of naive. So my awakening to what being a person of color in these roles, my awakening to that and what that meant came a little bit later, because we're in a church, right? This is the church. And it's not just any church. This is the Free Methodist Church, abolition and women. And those are the things we fight for. So why am I experiencing this friction? And it must be me. I must not fit. There's something wrong with me. Until a middle-aged white male mentor handed me a book and said, you need to read this because you need to know what you're up against. And if you were at the AHN conference, that is when you say, and that's when I knew the fight was real. Because that book was White Fragility, a book written by a white person for white people, and yet my experiences were all over those pages. That's when I knew the fight was real.
Thank you, ladies. I want to give you the opportunity to kind of respond to each other. So you heard each other's stories. Was there something you really identified with that someone else said, or is there a certain emotion that you felt as you heard one of your sisters share her story? So if anyone would like to respond to that.
Well, I think, Marissa, as you were just sharing about, hitting those barriers. And I think for us as women, the barriers are constantly there. They might be small barriers like microaggressions, but, when you come up against those things, you either have to go around it or you have to push through it. And so that is very tiring. And I think there's a point, you know, we're in an area where we're surrounded by a lot of Baptist, predominantly Baptist churches. And of course, our church, which is a Free Methodist church, 114-year-old Free Methodist church, they had a lot of evangelical cultural thinking. They had a lot of Baptist theology. There were just a lot of things where we had to recognize that we can't theologically debate with you why women have the authority to teach over men. We're just going to show you. And if you can't handle that, if the Holy Spirit is not talking to you, because I swear, when I read parts of scripture, the voice of God is not a man's voice every time. As a matter of fact, when I read certain parts of scripture, especially these verses that talk about injustice, I hear a woman's voice screaming out for justice for her sisters, for her daughters, for her mothers. And so, you know, we all I know is I have to be the best example I can be of what a woman pastor looks like, and just leave it up to God, whether that it's not my job to convince that person, it's my job to just preach that gospel and be the best example.
Soo Ji, it reminds me about when people kind of quote, argue or tease about what language does God speak, right? And so we hear God in our mother tongue. And so the same is true. God is not male or female. God is all of that. He said he made us male and female in his own image. So it's not one or the other, it's all. So it makes sense that, you know, we may hear a female voice or a male voice. We might hear a different language than one another. Does anyone else have something you want to say in response to what you heard from your sisters?
Well, I was really touched by her internalized pain, because I think that there's a lot of things that women internalize naturally. There's a certain amount of insecurity almost that we've been taught. And that's why we're always wrestling with how we look, you know, what we're wearing, what size we are, and all those other kind of things. So naturally, if you hear the negative voices, even in your protected and safe space, there's just so many opportunities then for that to actually do soul crushing, to make you feel less than. And you have to be careful, because that's the work of the enemy of our souls.
Right.
That really is the way. And he's using those that should be protecting and helping and supporting and working with to be others. And sometimes people don't realize they're being manipulated in that way, that they're being used that way. A pastor within our conference just this past week was doing her meditative prayer, and she does that by way of a live Facebook thing each day. But someone took it upon himself to call her prior to that, to tell her all the reasons why she was wrong to be a woman in ministry. And he did it right before her broadcast. And it really disturbed her soul. And it was one of those self-righteous, indignant moments where they clearly knew all of the answers and were certain that they were right. And sometimes you just have to block out the noise.
Yeah.
You know, we have to put on our Teflon suits and move forward, because we can't get rid of all of the naysayers.
I think definitely what Marissa said about just, you come and you're thinking, okay, I've got the place, or I got this so clear, the Lord said it, and then you confronted with the looks and the, you're confronted with the, I'm not sure you're really smart enough to be teaching me, right? I'm not sure if you've got the right words to be someone who's qualified to teach me, and that sort of thing. And I think one of the hardest things is that personal, internal, because one of the things in the Latino community is that the majority of the difficulty is from within the Latino community, because it's hard for them to see you as your pastor. With what you said, that's like tit for tat, William and I. William is the pastor, and everything he does, Marianne is just here running the show, but she's not the pastor. William is, and it's one of those things that you've got to be secure in who you are and what the Lord has called you to do. But it's a hard road, because you do question and you are insecure. And, when you're someone like me who is You know, I know how to be hood, but I know how not to be hood because I was raised in the hood, but I was educated. You know what I mean? And you got hair that looks like mine, where everybody wants to wonder, how do you do that? I mean, I was just born. Like, that's how it happens, guys. It just is. You know, can I touch it? You know, you do a lot of interesting things. It's like so many different aspects of you, you know, like, you shouldn't wear that. Well, my body is not gonna change. It's never gonna look like yours, right? So many things and so many pressures on not only being someone of color, but then on top of that being a woman, or a woman, and then being on top of that someone of color, that I think all of our stories really do connect at some point, because we're dealing with these struggles, maybe in our context and in different locations, but it's still inherently the same battle that we've been having for Adam and Eve, you know, ever since Adam and Eve in the fall, that women, how good is a woman? How good can a woman be? And always in relation to a man. So I think it's important for us not only to know who the Lord is calling us to be, but I know you're getting into this later, but having the right people, the right circles, and having those right allies that remind you, and kind of like, I see you. And I see who the Lord has called you to be, and it may be different in me, and I might not know what to do with it, but I still see you, and it's okay. I think we need that.
Yeah, that was the string that I was going to touch on, is, you know, each of these ladies mentioned the WHWC, and I'm newly experiencing that conference. I went to the last one like right before the world flipped and changed, and I remember, you know, getting to JFK and calling my husband. I'm like, I can get a rental car back. Like, maybe this isn't such a great idea, because everything was changing. But just the importance, just like we talked about with the networks, of having that safe space where you are seen, where you are welcome, where you are heard, where you can come and step in the fullness of who you were created to be, without having to compromise to fit into a box of expectations that somebody else has set for you.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I've resolved that has empowered me to resolve to do is I will no longer reside in places where I can't fully show up as me, because that means I am dimming the glory of God that I bring to the table. So I won't do that anymore.
So Marianne mentioned allies, so we're going to take a couple minutes to talk about that. And I want to just draw attention to the fact, so we have the 3 clergy women closest to me all have clergy husbands, okay? So it's a very different experience. Marissa and I do not have clergy husbands. We have other women serving single, which we have men serving single. That's a whole nother thing you have to deal with, because there's expectations for your spouse. So let's take a moment, you know, that may or may not affect your answer. We also just kind of want to talk about allies. So it may, in some of your cases, been your husband. It could be a superintendent. It could be, you know, a man or a woman. Just tell us something about someone who has been there for you and has helped open doors for you.
Well, you know, I was fortunate that in the first Free Methodist church that my husband and I were a part of, that we actually had several women pastors on staff. And so once again, this was the first Free Methodist church that we were a part of in Seattle. It was an urban multi-ethnic church. If that had not been the first church that Joe and I had been a part of, we don't know if we would have stuck around long enough to fall in love with Free Methodism. So I had a lot of women on staff that were allies, that had paved that road for me. You know, my husband and I met doing ministry. I was doing ministry before I met my husband. And it doesn't matter where in the journey it falls, because I know sometimes women marry their husbands who are pastors and then realize, wait, I'm doing everything too. Maybe I should get that title too. But it's not just a title. It's not just like something that you graduate with and you just, you know, have a medal for. It's a call. It really is a call. Believe us, we would not be doing this.
Amen.
If God, if it wasn't like, no, you will be disobedient if you don't do this, you know. And I don't want to be like Jonah and be that reluctant prophet that gets swallowed by the fish, because there's a work that God wants us to do. And just like in the workforce, how we're seeing executive and senior levels of management, women taking those roles, we're starting to see that happening in the church. And that fight is hard, because as much as we see that struggle in the world and we see the challenges and we see the sticky situations in the church, it's even worse. You know, you would think the people that love God and study his scriptures and that serve the poor and marginalized would understand how Jesus advocated for women and stood up for women. But a lot of times it feels like it's reversed. And like, once again, that cognitive dissonance, like there's a theology there that I thought I understood to be part of our tradition and our belief system, but yet we're just not seeing that embodied. So.
I would say for me, definitely my husband, you know, one of those who kind of tries to make an effort. It took us a road to get here, right? Him and I had to kind of like settle that first, like, okay, what does this mean? Because we are both pastors' kids and we didn't see it in our parents. So we felt it, but we didn't know how to navigate it properly because we didn't have the example. You know, great parents, great pastors, we didn't see the dynamic the way ours is. So it took us time, but I think he's definitely my greatest ally and just my champion. You know, he's the one that champions me on. But I think also superintendents that I had, and it seems small, but it was significant for me. In our annual conference, we've never had anyone lead or speak or lead any of the specific moments aside from the normal, you know, let's just say the normal people. And there was one annual conference, I'll never forget, and I'm not gonna name him just so everyone doesn't remember him, but our superintendent at the moment invited me to lead one of the morning sessions. And that was significant for me, not because you're looking for recognition or not because you need to be in front of people to validate, but it means something different when someone says, I believe in you and I believe in the call that you have enough to place you at this place, you know, and believe that God has a word through you that he wants to deliver to us. So I consider him an ally because I feel like that it maybe broke something for me, right? Where it gave me a little bit more of just security and maybe freedom that I needed.
I'm really fortunate that, you know, I've known Michael since we were freshmen in college, in undergrad. And he's never been intimidated by smart women, ever. You know, he just isn't. But many men are. And especially if they see that there are people who are going to accomplish things or have leadership or whatever, that's really just never been a thing. And so his advocacy is actually very, very natural. And it doesn't just come toward me, it comes to other women that he recognizes have abilities and should be encouraged as well. So that's been a huge blessing. My best friend and I are more alike than different. You know, she literally is my sister from another mother. And we've been running parallel lives. And so, but she's in the AME church and she's been an AME girl her entire life, generations of AME. And so when I would talk to her about the call and that, of course, she was always very, very supportive. And like I said, in the most traditional African-American churches, women in ministry is not, it's just not an issue. It's not as big an issue, I should say. And of course, there have been superintendents, and I'd also say Bishop Matt Thomas, you know, he just kind of feeds into people a lot. He does. And so he was very encouraging to both me and Michael along the way. And his encouragement came at just the right time, if I'm honest, because in 2015 and 2016, we were really considering whether or not we wanted to remain Free Methodists. And we were truly feeling displaced. And that's really how we came to spending a little bit of time in the United Methodist Church. The diversity and things that were happening there were very good, but we were having bigger issues with our home. And that was the reason why we were looking in other places. And so having the right encouragement and to stay in there and continue forward has been very useful.
Yeah, man, I am just so blessed to now have like a whole bowl full of folks that I would call my allies at this point. But I think some of those turning point allies, like you said, I was kind of at that point where I didn't know if FM was really for me. But Kathy became one of those allies that really created a seat at a table where I felt welcome and heard and seen. And then, you know, like the three of you ladies mentioned my husband. My husband is not only not in ministry, but my husband is not a believer. And that always causes some looks. and some thoughts that people feel the need to share with me. But my husband, so he is not a believer. He is not in the church because of all the things that we've been talking about today, because of all the hurt that he has seen perpetrated by people who say they're doing it in the name of Jesus. And so me finding my voice and finding a group of people who encouraged me has really strengthened our relationship. And I like to say he's not a believer yet. He has spent more hours in church side by side with me, helping me, than most people who call themselves regular churchgoers. When Sunday mornings and we are at church as a family, I'm at work and he is dad, and he is making making sure that our girls are, taken care of and behaving themselves and all of that. So yeah, it just adds a little bit of a different dynamic because, we talked briefly about intersectionality. So that becomes another intersection, especially in the church where it's like, oh my. So
I do want to mention that if you're an ally or want to become an ally, that you really need to read the book Developing Female Leaders by Katie Cole. Just go ahead and order that right now for everybody in your life and give it to them for Christmas. And Katie's going to be one of our keynotes at the WHWC conference, but there's just some really practical steps on how to develop female leaders and how to understand the different barriers that female leaders will face in the church.
Which is kind of what we want to close with. Our last question, if you have just a quick answer to a sentence or two, or if you could pick one thing that you wish other people understood, could do, it could be the lay people you interact with, it could be your fellow pastors, it could be the superintendents, the bishops. What one thing would you choose? Like, if you would do this, it would really help.
I think just what I just said right now is if you want to be an ally, then actually do it. Find out the reasons why women in your church have such a hard time leading. And these are lay leaders too, not just women pursuing ordination, but recognize that women are conditioned to not speak and to not lead. And that once again, that multiplies when they're raised in the church. So read that book and understand that there's ways that you as a person of influence can help change that for somebody else.
I would add to that something we've talked a lot about during this time. Listen more and fight the urge of making assumptions. We kind of like to lump people together in the same category and assume that we know the stories and things like that. Let's just listen to each other more, because sometimes you have no idea what we're feeling or what's really happening, and we just gotta listen a little better.
I'd encourage us to be more permissive. Be permissive in that you allow people to be who they authentically are. We don't all have to fit into one mold, into one character, one behavior pattern to be authentically okay. And so, if your natural bent is towards smiling or talking more or being more quiet, whichever variety it is, that's okay as well. There really is nothing more irritating for me than to be told women are too emotional. I wrestled with that one quite a bit. Because I think that, in fact, we all have emotions, though often we have them suppressed. Yeah. And I'm not talking about allowing a person to be histrionic, but I am saying give people permission to be who they authentically are and not try to make them fit into your idea of who they should be.
representation, that's my one word. Representation, 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 and not cheap representation. There's a difference between tokenism and an actual representation. And tokenism, the difference is in the intent. When your intent is just to have somebody represented to check the box, but not necessarily given a voice at the table, that's tokenism. But representation is creating that space for that person to be as themselves in that space, and we need more of it.
Thank you for that. And you'll notice if you look at the pictures of all the Justice Network speakers, we had James as our token white male. And that's it, right? I want to say something as someone who had 4 babies when Marianne mentioned being pregnant. So I had 4 babies in ministry. We have bishops and BOA members in the room. We need a denominationally wide family leave policy because there are conferences and there are churches who there are those who have wonderful attitudes about that. And, you know, it's triggering for me. And I think of Jeremy's here, his wife, you know, going through this years ago. And so those of us that have tried to have babies in ministry and have had that experience, I actually, my own church was fine, but we just need a policy about that. It just should be something that's out there. So that's a very concrete thing that I would suggest. So thank you, ladies, for your time.